My name is Trevor Hansen with the City of Lincoln Watershed Management. This presentation will go over a variety of topics relating to our city's program regulating construction stormwater permits, also known as NOIs.
I wanted to include some recent news and updates regarding the EPA. The EPA does compliance audits in the city of Lincoln as well. They had one done in 2019 with a site, and they actually fined them $30,000 for lack of compliance with their SWIP. They also just did another recent audit with another site this past August where a $60,000 fine was handed down for lack of compliance with the SWIP. So we just wanted to reiterate that it's not just the city of Lincoln doing inspections, it's also the state, and then it's also the EPA as well. And there could be some heavy fines and penalties for lack of compliance regarding the SWIPs.
First thing I'll start off with is to go over a few helpful items relating to our state's stormwater online portal. As you may already know, the online portal is where users go to apply for NOI permits as well as upload SWIP inspection reports. I want to go over a few common questions we often get asked relating to the portal. This FAQ document can be found on the state's website, shown with the blue link at the top right. I just also want to clarify that the portal is run through the state and it is theirs to maintain. Feel free to contact the city with any questions or technical issues, but just know we will pass it along to the state and it is theirs to resolve. First question, how can I transfer an active CSW permit to a new certified official? Unfortunately, there is not a way to do this without opening up a new NOI application. The permittee will then need to close the old permit by submitting a notice of termination. How long does it take to get approval once the NOI has been submitted? This can vary greatly. With the state, it can be up to 30 days if a game and parks review is needed, and with the city, it can be up to 7 calendar days. Can I modify information on the notice of intent after it's submitted? The only information the applicant can modify is the project end date. And the only person who can do this is the user who applied for the NOI application. Who can submit the notice of termination? Again, this is only the user who applied for the permit. The person that filled out that notice of intent is no longer with the company. If this happens, you will need to contact the state to have the project transferred to a new username. Is there a fee for the CSW permit? There is no state or city fee relating to this permit. And any questions here, I did reference the state contact with the below right link there. Feel free to contact them as needed. I want to point out a few of the search query options that many might not be aware of. If you log into the portal and you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, there are two search databases that the public can use. The first one I'm going to highlight is the CSW NOI permit number search query. This one is used to look up project CSW numbers, a project status, and to view and print the NOI application. The next search option I want to highlight is the CSW NOI public access. This is used to look up all documents relating to a specific project, including applications, plans, inspection reports, etc. You need to know the project CSW number in order to search for this. And the last search option I wanted to highlight is the inspection report search query. This can be found under the SWIP inspection reporting section. This is used to look up SWIP inspection reports relating to a project. You can search with multiple options. It pulls up every report that was submitted through the system for a specific project. This is important to know if you need to know if your project is current on SWIP reporting. A couple more items to relate to the inspection reporting specific to the City of Lincoln. All projects must submit their SWIP inspection reports online through this portal. We do not accept handwritten reports. You do not have to keep the SWIP or hard copies of the inspection reports on site as long as the site has internet access. So we just need a way to be able to look up these reports. You must keep the reports up to date. For the City of Lincoln specific regulation, you must upload within 5 days of doing the actual inspection. Inspections must be conducted at least once every 14 days and within 24 hours of the end of a storm event, half inch or greater. Failure to submit these reports in the portal may result in an enforcement action, including the issuance of a $75 reinspection fee every 14 days until the violation is corrected. I want to go over a specific example for the SWPPP inspection reports themselves. And just some items to note, the inspection reports need to be up to date and filled out completely. This includes answering all required questions and signing the inspection report. The reports need to be accurate and detailed, and it's always okay to write down the issues. Not writing down any issues time and time again is a clear indication that there is probably something more going on here, and is a good example of where the city will look into this project more. So just for an example, on the left side here, we have each question: are all slopes and disturbed areas not actively being properly stabilized? You need to write down if it's implemented, yes, no, maintenance required, yes, no, and then a detailed description of the location and what is needed. Users are also free to upload their own reports, but it just needs to be similar, where it gives, is maintenance required, has it been implemented, and a detailed location as needed. SWPPP signs. SWPPP signs are another big one that we get a lot of questions about. Basically, every NOI project needs to have and install a SWPPP sign near the entrance or near their job trailer or a spot that's easily seen from the street. Basically, the SWPPP sign just needs to have the project name, the CSW number, the SWPPP location. If the location is online only, you just need to post the website to where it can be accessed. The SWPPP contact name, and then that name's contact information. The sign itself can vary for the size. We just need to be able to see all the information posted on it. Moving on to storm sewer inlet protection. This is by far one of the most overused and misunderstood BMPs that we see today. Just to go over some main items for what we see in Lincoln and what we kind of want to see. These must be installed during the active construction phase, but they should not be installed on streets or roads that are open to public traffic. This is a big one, and where we might actually vary from other towns and cities. Basically, we see too many people driving over these, them causing flood hazards in the public right of way. We do not want to see these once these roads and streets become opened. It's basically a bigger mess than it actually tries to solve. Under certain circumstances, however, with linear projects, curb inlet protection can be installed where traffic is open to the public, as long as the BMP does not pose a risk of getting damaged or a hazard for that. So basically, we've seen a lot more of these wire mesh and fabric inlet inserts style BMPs. Those are actually the preferred method that we want to see nowadays. These are good because they're easier to maintain. They're not full of the rubber pieces that can blow up and cause more pollution into the water. These are a good option for those linear projects. And here's a photo of one for an example. They're really easy to kind of take out. They're not as heavy. We found good success with these so far. So that's kind of what we're recommending going forward. But if you have any questions with inlet protection, every project is different. So you basically just need to follow the erosion control plan, and if needed, contact the SWPPP designer for that project, or more importantly, contact one of us so we can discuss the options going forward. And staying with the inlet protection, here's an example of what we don't want. Here's some good items to follow. Do not install in any sump areas. It's basically where the low point of a street or road is. Do not direct the runoff from your site downstream. We've had a big one where you're pushing all the water that's supposed to go on and stay on your site and causing an issue for neighbors or other projects. It's definitely a no-no for that one. Another big one we always see is do not block the entire opening of the inlet. A lot of these filter bags, they're not as wide in the middle, which is designed to let an overflow go over them if needed. If you block in the whole entire throat of the inlet, it's just going to cause flooding, and it's not going to be easy to resolve that. Basically, just don't create situations where mud deposits on the public right away. Kind of need to be smart about where these are installed. If you got a project and a big roadway is right down the street, you don't want to push all the runoff to that street, and you don't want to have the inlet down the street blocked and causing the mud to deposit at that location. This is a very kind of important thing that we're seeing nowadays, and we kind of need to find some solutions around this. So here's are some examples of the inlet protection. For the photo on, or I should say the lack of inlet protection, for the photo on the left, this is during the active construction phase, kind of during the mass grading, right before the sewer is built itself. Too often we see where these just stay unprotected. Runoff can just flow right into that storm sewer vault there and into that system. This is not an acceptable solution, and also not an acceptable solution is just throwing those big red or the gutter eel filter bags. That's not going to cut it. For something like this, you would need more of total protection around the entire perimeter of that storm sewer inlet. A good example would be installed silt fence there. For the photo on the right, here's an example of when paving has just been completed, but as you can see, the top bare soil area is still unstabilized. Runoff can still get in through over the top. And then this specific project decided to try and put the filter bags in, but the subcontractors over the months and weeks and years that these go on, they just run them over, as we talked about earlier, and that's not an acceptable solution there. Something more to the fact where if you can stabilize it where you don't even need storm sewer inlet protection in the first place, that's ideal. But if you're going to have one, that's where we recommend the wire mesh inserts. And here's some more examples. For the photo on the left, this is dealing with a different type of sewer inlet opening. There's all sorts of types, so you just have to know what the shape is, what the opening size is, and plan accordingly. For this one, as you can see, it's not the black filter bag there doesn't do anything. It's just kind of blocking it so it can go around the bag and inside the storm sewer system. For this one, it's a good case of knowing the correct BMP here. So you need to protect that grate on the bottom as well as the throat opening on the curb. And then also you need to protect the bare soil area in the right of way. Ideally, it's best to get that stabilized. Photo on the right here is a good example of what we see quite a bit with heavy downpours with street flooding. There is actually two storm sewer inlets there with the similar black filter bags stuffed into the opening, causing clogging issues, which then we get something like this, which turns into a bigger mess because then we have to get LPD involved with the police, and then we have to stop traffic, potentially close down the street for a while. And if that's the case, then that's when we're really going to go after enforcement. This is a good example of knowing the correct BMP, knowing how to install it correctly, basically not blocking the entire opening. Every site's going to be different, so these are things that you got to keep up with. And looking at some of the solutions that we talked about for the inlet protection, the photo on the left here is a good example of the wire mesh insert. And you can see that little top opening there where it still allows floodwaters, or during a heavy storm event, water can still get in there, so it's not going to cause street flooding. On the photo on the right, here's a good example of blocking and putting in a good sediment barrier in the right-of-way area on top, so runoff cannot overflow that curb there, and then also obviously installing the curb opening wire mesh inserts. So I wanted to move to just some common BMP issues that we see from time to time. To start out, just basically the photo I'm going to show on the left here is just knowing what a critical area is. If your project is right next to a busy right-of-way area, busy street, sidewalk, this is something that's going to have eyes on it 24/7, and it's just that much more important to stay on top of. Another good point is to be prepared for extreme weather events. If it's something like this where you're going to have a downpour, it's going to cause some flooding, that's really not where we want to be. We need to stay on top of it and prepare accordingly. The photo on the right here is just showing a good example of the small right-of-way space to even deal with to begin with. So once the silt fence fails, you're already looking with mud going onto the street, which is going to be a major, major hazard there. That's going to be a really big enforcement issue for us that we will definitely pursue. Just knowing the critical areas, knowing if you're going to be backed up to a busy street, it's a better idea to install additional measures than to have the lack of them and then try and prepare for the worst. So touching on what I was explaining earlier, understanding the correct BMP for each situation. Here's a mass grading site, an unstabilized with a lot of chance for runoff. And here's a completed storm sewer inlet top where they threw in a gutter eel filter bag that is pretty much doing nothing. You could argue it's slowing down the flow for the runoff, but it's still entering the opening there and getting into the system. Here's a good example of where, for one, you need to have the correct BMP on the inlet protection there. Good example would be a silt fence installed all the way around it. And then the other solution here is you just need to stabilize those areas where you can. That even prevents the runoff from leaving that area in the first place. For a different type of project here on the left, it's a good example of the roadside ditches and just the need for the correct BMP to even begin with. So for this one, the water is going to flow downward to the flared-in section there with a section of silt fence installed. Notice the silt fence is not the high porosity either, it's just the standard regular silt fencing. So to start off with, that's not an acceptable BMP for this. It's also missing the ditch checks. Example would be using straw wattles to slow down the runoff there. And the need to stabilize the soil is that much more important. For this one, you need blankets, the seed down. It's just a good idea to get those things put in place sooner than later. It's going to cause a lot less headache. The photo on the right here, example of a weak BMP that was put where a more reinforced BMP was needed. The straw wattle did not last, and with the flows that they had from this mass grading site further upstream, it just blew out the wattle, and now everything is going right down the storm sewer inlet and into the neighborhood. The need for berms and reinforced BMPs at the end of paving sections is really critical. A critical thing that we're not seeing, which is a really big one, is the back of curb BMPs. As soon as the utilities and paving are completed, a lot of the sites don't reinstall the needed measures. We understand the utility companies and the paving contractor comes in and rips everything out that you had down, but you need something to be reinstalled so all the mud does not just go on to that newly paved street. Big example is being able to stabilize the bare soil areas on the back of the curb, installing the right curb inlet protection if needed. We want to get the area stabilized most importantly. That will solve most of the issues. And the photo on the right here is just showing the complete lack of BMPs and how the runoff velocities, they're going to find a specific spot on the curb to blow out in. And every time that's going to be a sump area or it's going to be a spot where cars usually travel. That's where we get the complaints and where we have to do the enforcement. It's really critical to get the seed down. If you can't do seeding, it's a bad time of the year, then you need to make some alternative measures. We've seen some other projects have good success with back of the curb berms. In addition, with silt fencing or wattles, basically you can consult your SWPPP designer for more creative ideas there. Good housekeeping. This is another critical aspect of the SWPPP that many don't think about or don't care about, that kind of needs to be more improved on. The photo on the left we see here looks like some PVC glue that was left out over time. Um, After the workers leave each day, they need to store away all chemical hazards in an appropriate locked container. What happens is we see a lot of the rainfall, and if they're left out to the weather elements, the stuff gets absorbed into the soils, or it runs off, leaving the site. The photo on the right here is just a good example of trash and the lack of proper containment. A lot of these smaller sites can cause quite a bit of issues with trash. So if you can imagine the big sites we deal with, it's just that much more. Every site needs to have the appropriate containers, and even more critical, those containers and dumpsters, they need to have coverings so the wind does not blow this stuff away. We've seen a lot of complaints about trash blown onto adjacent properties. A lot of the things we hear is, well, this trash came onto my site, why do I have to pick it up? Well, it's just the way it is. That's why it's so critical to have everything kind of contained. For those concrete and mortar stations that we see on some of these projects, a lot of them, they're kind of neglected, they're not protected properly, and the slurry basically gets into the runoff, and then it gets into the storm sewers, causing a mess. Each of these, it's so important to have good housekeeping around these and the proper BMPs protecting it. A lot of this stuff is not going to be good for the wildlife on the adjacent properties. It can affect the pH and in turn affect our water quality for the negative. Just critical to where these are placed as well. It's never a good idea to place these right next to a waterway. We have seen that. These should be stationed somewhere in the central part of the project, well protected, away from those critical areas. We get quite a few complaints about concrete slurry when cutting concrete or working with concrete in general, especially for those paving projects. The slurry needs to be contained. It cannot be allowed to go into the storm sewer system. Some options to contain the slurry we've seen. You can use solidifiers, a lot of options online there to buy those. And then filter fabric, for example, burlap, something to dam up the slurry, keep it in place, and then vacuum it up or scoop it up as needed. For those temporary soil stockpiles for specific projects, or if it's a repair in the right of way, all stockpiles need to be properly protected if they're not going to be removed by the end of each day. This is really critical where we see the runoff caused by unprotected stockpiles from the rain. Good solutions to this include tarps or barriers right next to them to prevent the runoff from entering the storm sewer system. Fueling stations, another big one. Tanks that are required to be on site, they should be double walled. So if they spurt a leak or something hits it, it's not going to cause a giant mess there. They also need to have secondary containment. This can include some sort of barrier around the station area. A good solution we've seen is contractors will excavate a small kind of hole, put a tarp down, and then tank on top of that. That's something easy to do. The photo on the right, definitely not advised. Do not store any type of grills or anything combustible near the tank itself. And every gas container in those not stored properly, that's an enforcement issue that will be written up. Dewatering is another critical one. We don't see these too often, but for the photo on the left, here's an example of a dewatering filter bag. These bags need to be checked often for damage, leaks, and whatnot. It's always a good idea to have an additional bag on site in case of a failure. For the photo on the right, great example of needing an additional measure downstream of the bag. It's always a good idea to place the filter bag in a spot where it can be treated again for that runoff that's leaving it before it leaves the site. Dust control, that's something that we have had to enforce on. Uh, this obviously happens during certain situations, time of the years, hot and windy, dry out, but every site must implement measures to mitigate dust when conditions arise. This is something that our health department also gets involved in with the air quality. So if you don't have any kind of measures in place to contain this, this is something where you will get enforcement from the health department as well as from us regarding the SWPPP. Some of those solutions, just a simple water truck on site. It's going to be a pain to keep doing it over and over again, but that's just what it's going to take. It's always a good idea to consult with your SWPPP designer for other ideas, but something that needs to be contained is definitely the dust control on those mass grading sites. Moving on to sediment basins. If a project has a sediment basin that is being used as the main BMP for a site where it collects all the runoff, it will obviously need to be cleaned out as needed. Capacity is 50%. It's a good idea to install benchmarks to know when to clean it out. And if the basin is going to be a permanent feature of that property, you're also going to have to clean it out at the very end of the project and provide the appropriate certifications and survey results that it is returned to full capacity. For the outlet structures, they all always need to be protected with the appropriate BMP. It's best to utilize skimmers to take the outlet discharge from the top of the water. That needs to be something that we see more of that we do not. The surrounding basin area with the slopes and bare soil areas need to be seeded as soon as possible. Continuing with the sediment basins, the photo on the left here is just showing kind of a temporary sediment basin with a standard riser pipe that we see quite a bit. For the City of Lincoln standards, you are required to install a rock filter around the riser pipe. You do not need to install the fabric or before that rock, though. We've seen where that can cause clogging issues and whatnot. So just need to have some sort of rock filter around it. And those are for the temporary basins. Photo on the right, we can just see where it's just been silted in and just needs to be cleaned out. It's always a good idea to install a benchmark, some sort of stake markings to know when it needs to be cleaned out. A lot of times the contractors, they're not aware, just so much easier to make it easier for them to know when to do it. If the discharges are sediment laden, they must implement additional practices to the maximum extent practicable downstream as well. Staying with the basin, I want to talk about skimmers. We don't see these enough throughout the Lincoln area, but we hope to kind of get more people using these going forward. The skimmers, they draw from the top of the water source where only the finest particles are discharged. Slow, consistent outflow promotes further settling into the basin. It's basically an industry standard through the EPA nowadays. And specifically for the state of Nebraska, the state does state in their general permit when a site is discharging from basins and impoundments, the site must utilize outlet structures that withdraw water from the surface unless unfeasible. So always a good idea. It's best to plan to need a skimmer and then just go from there. For the permanent outlet structures, such as the box outlet structure, it must have a safety and trash grate installed over the top of the opening, or another mechanism such as a railing or fencing installed if the structure poses a safety hazard. For the City of Lincoln standards, if there is a drop greater than 6 feet from the structure itself, that would classify as a public safety hazard where you would need mechanisms such as fencing, grate, something in place where the child or something cannot fall into that box structure itself. Moving on to construction entrances. This is something that is standard across the board for SWPPs. You need to have the appropriate entrance installed per the erosion control plan. It needs to have the appropriate rock size. It needs to have the appropriate filter fabric underneath it. It's always a good idea to limit the areas where vehicles can enter and exit the site. So if you need to block off other areas where you do not want contractors and subs to enter, that is a requirement where you're going to have to block that off. Always a good idea to keep a sweeper or a broom on site so you can clean up as needed. Like I mentioned earlier, you need to have the filter fabric underneath, and then you also need to add additional rock as needed. It's always a good idea to consider alternate methods for the entrances. There is a lot of great products out there nowadays that are an improvement on the traditional rock entrance. These can include rumble mats, the plates, wheel wash stations. These are all a good idea that, yeah, it's going to cost more up front, but these are reusable type of measures that can be used over and over again, and it's going to have improved results. So always a good idea to look into these type of measures. I did want to mention surface roughening as an acceptable BMP that is not utilized as it should be. For a lot of these sites that have a lot of open areas with the bare soil, a simple surface roughening method is an effective BMP that you will see great results to limit the sediment-laden discharge from a site. It's something that can be done with equipment that's already on site. It's a low-cost alternative. It's best if used in conjunction with other BMPs though. So if you're going to have surface roughening of a large area, you're still going to need the appropriate perimeter BMPs as needed. But this is something that we try to encourage more of. It's so easy to do, and always we see great results with it if done correctly. Moving on to temporary seeding. This is something that's in our standards and the requirements for the SWPPP. You must implement on bare soil areas that will be inactive for 14 days or more. Always try and get across that vegetation, seeding, permanent, temporary. It's by far the best BMP out there. It's going to be the best to do up front. A lot of the contractors and developers that we see, they might not want to spend money on seeding right away, but it's going to save you more money doing it right the first time than having to come back and repair these BMPs over and over again. It's by far the best investment for a project relating to the SWPPP. Staying with temporary seeding, just basically knowing when to reseed as needed. Lack of vegetation that we see on some of these bigger sites is always going to be a cause for runoff discharge somewhere. We know there's probably going to be an issue with the site if the seeding isn't done on time. A good example would be seeding with the appropriate mix, drill seeding, dormant seeding. All these can be utilized as needed. Phasing is also a critical aspect of the SWPPP. It's best to conserve as much vegetation and to leave as big of a buffer as you can. Per the EPA, a 50-foot buffer is required between construction activity and any waters of the U.S. So basically, if you're having a mass grading site, try and leave a large section vegetated until you absolutely have to. Such a simple thing to kind of do. We don't want to see a giant site just open up all the land. There's going to be many enforcement issues with that. Seeding into the right-of-way to prevent runoff is another important thing to keep in mind. If cedar vegetation is damaged by other construction activity, or if unable to seed into the right-of-way for some other reason, you need to have another measure at the back of the curb like we spoke about earlier. A lot of the times we get questions about, yeah, the utility contractors come in and tear up all my BMPs and mess up all of the seeding that I did. Unfortunately, it's still on that permittee to reinstall those measures or to educate the utility contractor where not to go, keep them off, make them responsible for it, but it's still on the permittee to make sure that their site is stabilized appropriately. And if you have any questions, we do have a lot of options to contact us, phone, email, or if you want kind of more of a general email that our entire division sees, you can email mpdes@lincoln.ne.gov. That's going to go to everyone, so always a good idea to kind of, if you have a general question, not sure who to go to, you can send it to that, and one of us will reach back to you with that.